Hi there everyone, Lars here with another D&D discussion brought to you by Camille's Harem. Not just a podcast for novice writers by novice writers, but also a YouTube channel by novice writers for novice writers, because writing is an adventure, it's more fun with friends. And today I want to look at dungeon crawling. Specifically, I'm going to look at how you can make dungeon crawling a part of your overall story in a fun and engaging way. There's a misunderstood stereotype when it comes to dungeon crawls, that they're just long, grinding slogs meant to help the party farm experience and useful items really quick. It's such a prevalent stereotype, in fact, that plenty of players hate dungeon crawling and would rather just play sillier moments, even though dungeon crawling is a necessary element within classic D&D. And meanwhile, plenty of games out there, and way too many isekai, use mini dungeon crawling moments to grind and create OP characters as fast as they can. More of the aggravation later on in this video. To shatter this stereotype, however, I want you to come with me, and let's have a look at the origins of dungeon crawling. Dungeons have been a staple of Dungeons & Dragons since the game's very beginning. Gary Gygax and his friends were creating basically their own fan fiction adventures based on the Lord of the Rings and other fantasy stories of that time. And there are all kinds of great ruins and caves to explore in Tolkien's stories, like the Mines of Moria, Dol Guldur, Goblin Town, the Mines of Moria, the Lonely Mountain, the Caverns of Isengard, Shelob's Lair, the Mines of Moria, the Barrow Downs, and did I mention the Mines of Moria already? So there was lots of material for Gary Gygax and his friends to draw on in order to create their own dungeons and cave diving quests. However, the concept of dungeon crawling came years later. They wanted to create an experience similar to the 1800s tradition of pub crawling, going from bar to bar and grinding and getting smashed to prove that you had the endurance that it took to get slammed that night. However, in this case, you're not getting smashed by alcohol, but by monsters, traps, and puzzles. It was a way within the game to see if the players and their characters were well balanced and equipped for much bigger events later on in the game. And this would essentially just mean putting the players and their characters through a gauntlet of various challenges. Now, this makes it sound like dungeon crawling was always meant to be a slog, but D&D dungeons are conceptually well designed. Gary Gygax wanted all of his dungeons to embody this specific idea. There is an ancient, fascinating past lost to time. Dungeons are broken windows into that past, full of unknown history, treasures, traps, and horrors. As such, they are puzzles to solve, but missing a number of pieces. You can learn and gain a lot, but you aren't necessarily supposed to get the whole story, at least from the perspective of the players and the characters. This makes the dungeons interesting because the party should always be on the back foot in some kind of way. It generates a natural challenge and obstacle. When we understand that this is the bare-bones nature of a classic dungeon, we can better understand how to build a meaningful dungeon crawl. Dungeons should not be treated as a means of just grinding for XP and cool loot, or as an exotic form of travel. If you do that, it kind of takes away from the atmosphere and the identity and nature of the dungeon itself, which is why so many isekai and games that just simply use dungeons for grinding out XP to turn out OP characters is really lame, because what, did someone just create this dungeon in order to make someone else OP? No, that goes against the very notion of these dungeons, that they are broken windows to a long-lost past full of traps, horrors, mysteries, puzzles, and the likes, which you can learn from, you can definitely gain from them, but they are not meant to make you OP, nor are they meant to completely fill you in on everything that you should know as the player. Furthermore, if you even go that route, it takes away from one of the most important aspects of Dungeons & Dragons in general, which is that the game is community storytelling. If you just go into a dungeon to slog things out, to become OP, to get items, you take away from the character building and team building moments that you should be having. Dungeons are meant to test all of the different players and their characters in ways that force them to grow and also force them to work with other people within their party in order to improve all together. So instead of usually making dungeons then a necessary element of the game, instead dungeons should be more often relegated to largely optional adventures that may or may not pay off to explore. To dive a little bit more into this, what I want to do is I want to look at some of the ideas that you can use within a game for good dungeon crawls, and then have a look at how dungeon crawling has been used in various stories to advance the plot and help the characters to progress. So let's first have a look at what can be done within the game, and then we'll then have a look at stories. So, I'm going to look at an example actually first from what I've done in one of my campaigns, which is from the series The Gangs of Arlisle. I've already done a 4-part mini-series on how that game played out. I highly recommend you go and you check it out because it's just kind of fun. It was really neat as a teacher leading a campaign of Dungeons & Dragons with multiple students and really bringing in a huge team, which went on a really fantastic story. But in any case, in the Gangs of Arlisle campaign, there is this massive complex of ancient dungeon tunnels beneath the city of Arlisle. And the players eventually found their way down to this dungeon while they were looking for gangsters who had been basically in open war against the security of the city. They were hiding serial killers. And so the players who had been hired to go and figure out, well, who's committing all these awful murders, had run afoul of the gangsters. They were now pursuing the gangsters, and this led them down into the bowels of the city through the sewage tunnels and behind a facade, behind an illusion, which led into the dungeons themselves. Now, each room within the dungeon was its own interesting, complex puzzle or trap. I actually got the idea from reading Brandon Moore's Fablehaven series, where all of the different keys to the demon prison are held behind these ridiculous dungeons and series of traps. And I was like, I really like this idea. Each room in this crazy dungeon complex will have its own unique trap or puzzle that the players have to figure out. One room was just a giant mouth that would swallow everyone. Another one required that they figure out which symbols would activate certain traps or cause the walls to come on in. Other rooms I took just right out of Fablehaven, where you basically have to sacrifice blood to a painting and call out a person or image on the painting to fight, and you have to fight that thing in order to progress through the next wall. Others required that you would have to do other kinds of sacrifices or that you'd have to cast the right kind of spell. Each room was its own unique puzzle, and that was meant in a story, for the story purpose, to prevent people from easily making it through the dungeons to the very end, because there is a horrifying secret at the end of the dungeon complex. Now, my players actually never really figured this out, and it was designed that way. In the overall story for the Gangs of Arlisle, the dungeons are actually essential to what's really happening in the overall story, but the players had to really dig in order to get there. I wasn't just simply going to be like, oh ho ho, you've discovered the dungeons, now let's have an amazing dungeon crawl to see what lies at the very end. No, instead they actually had to do a dungeon crawl to catch up with who they thought were the gangsters who were hiding out in the dungeon. Turns out that they actually had uncovered a drow invasion. So it got weird, wonky, and real fun really fast. Again, check out the mini-series for the Gangs of Arlisle to see the whole story. But the dungeons existed, like I said right here, what should be optimal in Dungeons & Dragons, as an optional adventure. The players were hired to figure out who was committing a series of murders, to stop them. They were hot on the trail. They realized that the serial killer was with these gangsters, so they need to find the gangsters. They just happened to find the wrong people while hunting down the gangsters. But then they actually ended up getting accidentally very close to end game material had they poked and prodded even further in the story. So the dungeons were there as a neat obstacle, and it certainly challenged them, and oh boy, they really literally had to work together as a team in order to survive just 3 rooms, but they managed to do it. And that was what I wanted to see. I wanted to see the players working together as a cohesive team in order to survive this short dungeon crawl. And had they tried to go even further, oh boy, they would have had to expend tons of material and spells just to continue on. That isn't necessarily always the way you wish to go with a dungeon crawl, because that can be too much of a grind, but that was what my story called for, that no one is actually supposed to make it through this dungeon. So there's that, but it existed still as that challenge, and I could tell that my players, had it not been for COVID shutting down school early that year, and also then bringing kind of a premature end to the game, the players probably would have returned to the dungeon just to give it a second go to see how far they could have gone. And oh boy, they would have been in for a gauntlet. Now, another idea for a good dungeon crawl, especially since this is Halloween, definitely go kind of the route of the Curse of Strahd. You can do dungeon crawls where the dungeon or the tomb or the castle holds a curse, like a vampire, a mummy, a great eldritch abomination, or maybe a disease that is not supposed to get out. And so the players are either going in to unwittingly unleash this horror upon the world, or they are going in to make sure that it is secure. Or they could be going on in as thieves. There's a lot of things that you can do to help set up a good dungeon crawl. We're either, hey, we're explorers and we just came across this castle, this ancient castle, we're going to explore it. We are grave robbers and we're plundering this tomb. Or we are vigilantes chasing the bad guys, and the bad guys have gone into this crazy cave, and oh my gosh, what we've just discovered within the cave. Dungeons are a great place where you can have ancient horrors hidden away. Why is that? Well, that helps actually to explain why a dungeon even exists in the first place. That some great evil from way back when that's been long forgotten was beaten, captured, and imprisoned and placed into such a place so that way it would be as hard as possible for anyone to get to it and unleash it again upon the world. That makes a pretty good explanation for a dungeon, and if it's been long lost to the world, it's a mystery that cannot be solved until the players get further along into the dungeon, where they then have to make crucial decisions about whether or not they wish to proceed. And if you're looking to make an excellent horror story, then by all means, there are so many options that you can put into a haunted dungeon, into a decrepit abandoned castle, into an unknown cave. There's so much that you can do with it. Not only does D&D have a lot of great formulas and already pre-prepared campaigns that you can use, but you can easily come up with your own stuff and put in what you want to make a good spooky adventure. Another great example of a dungeon crawl comes from Critical Role Season 2's campaign with the Folding Halls of Hellas. Oh boy, I loved and hated these episodes so much because the grind was so rough. The Folding Halls of Hellas were meant to punish everyone who went in who wasn't supposed to be inside of that crazy interdimensional ball. For those of you who haven't seen Critical Role Season 2, the main characters come across this orb that if they're able to unlock it, they can go into basically a 100-room mansion that pieces together all of these different dimensions, and there are all kinds of traps, monsters, automatons, and restrictions from room to room, puzzles that have to be solved, and the whole thing is actually meant to be a mage killer. So if you're a character who relies on magic, you're kind of screwed, and if you're a fighter, you are in trouble because you need support, and that support probably won't come as you then fight against these massive machines and monsters that were meant to then kill or capture the disempowered mages. So the Folding Halls of Hellas, definitely check that out if you haven't already heard of that, because that could be a really crazy place to play, and especially if you want to really challenge your players. And then finally, for one last idea of what you could do within a game, I'll go with this one: a dragon-conquered castle. I mean, of course, there's always the dragon-guarded castle, which is you gotta go save a princess, but I'm talking here dragon-conquered castle. The dragon came in, blasted the place up, dug its own nest in, and has accumulated its hoard somewhere within this decrepit castle. Now, the dragon can have used its magic to do all kinds of things, where now you have like animated corpses that you have have to fight against special traps. The dragon can hear you, can blast you with magic or with its breath weapon from different angles, different places. You can't even see the dragon coming because it has shaped this castle to basically be a death trap for anyone who goes on into it. It's not a typical dungeon, but it still consists of a dungeon crawl where the players have to work together to solve the riddles of how this place was put together, what its traps are, and overcome whatever obstacles the dragon has put on into it. You can have a whole lot of fun with this, and it's basically a ticking time bomb where you only can go in so far and for so long before the dragon realizes you're there, and then you have to fight a dragon. And you then have to figure out where's the best place to fight this dragon and how in order to survive. That could be a really interesting way of doing a dungeon crawl because, well, the players have no idea when it's all going to blow up in their faces. It's kind of nice to have that ticking time bomb element going because it prevents the story from becoming too much of a slogfest. Now, really, we could sit down here for a very long time and talk about all different kinds of things that you could do to make an excellent dungeon crawl adventure within the game Dungeons & Dragons. And again, just remember that if you are going to create your own dungeon crawl within your campaign, that the dungeon should usually be kind of an optional journey, and that it's not there to, again, help people just grind and gain XP and whatnot, because that's not the purpose of the story. As much as isekai anime says, it's not meant to create OP characters. Instead, they are these broken windows into a long-lost past that you can explore either to your own detriment or to your own benefit. And you as the dungeon master can have a whole lot of fun in putting these dungeons together in a way that hopefully challenges your party, that makes them then have to really work together and pull out all the stops in order to survive and proceed. That can be one of the most rewarding experiences for your players when they're forced to work together, and that really is what makes D&D a community storytelling medium. So now that we've had a look at how dungeon crawling can be used within the game Dungeons & Dragons, let's think about how dungeon crawling can actually be utilized to help make a story more fun and engaging, and especially to help move along the plot and the characters. There are some ideas that immediately come to mind. Again, Mines of Moria. Okay, so why the Mines of Moria? Because I brought that up at the beginning. Well, it's because it is probably one of the most epic dungeon crawls of all time, and it is in a modern myth. Tolkien drew on from all different kinds of stories. Like, there are definitely some ancient stories and ancient poems that have stanzas and little chapters that involve going into ancient places or dungeons or decrepit castles and looting them. He brought that all together for the Mines of Moria. In this particular story, in this particular part of the Lord of the Rings story, the Fellowship of the Ring, it has to get the ring to Mordor, but they are in a very bad place because the easiest route is to go through the Gap of Rohan, but that brings them too close to Isengard, and Saruman has closed the Gap of Rohan to them by using his armies and his scouts to put out a pretty powerful net to catch the Fellowship. So they decide to go over the mountains via the pass of Kradras, which then the mountain hurls them back, and they are defeated by the mountain. So, if they don't want to risk getting captured by Saruman and his armies, they have to go through the Mines of Moria. The thing about the Mines of Moria is that this is a kingdom that had long ago fallen to Durin's Bane, the Balrog, and then the dwarves had fought a massive war to then reclaim it from the orcs and goblins. And while the dwarves did succeed for a time, they were not strong enough to possess the kingdom of Khazad-dûm and repopulate Moria. As a result, they abandoned it once again to Durin's Bane, and the orcs returned and established a whole new kingdom under the mountain. The dwarves didn't know that, and Gimli's cousin Balin led a company of dwarves back to Khazad-dûm to try to restart it at least as a small mithril colony, and if it did well, they would then import more dwarves and try to reclaim the entirety of Moria as a whole. However, when they went there, they were quickly sealed off by the orcs and then were defeated piecemeal until the last of the dwarves were killed, and by this time Balin was already dead. However, much of that information is not known to the outside world. So as far as Gandalf and Gimli are actually concerned within the book, they think that the colony is still up and running and that there is a chance that with Balin's help they will be able to make it through Moria and make a clean shot at Lothlorien before Saruman can catch them. However, as they go through the Mines Mines of Moria, once they have gotten through the wall, after they've gotten in through the first gate, and they are chased by the Watcher in the water, it becomes very clear really fast that the colony, if it still exists, isn't doing well. And it's very clear that Moria lies largely abandoned. Now, Moria is an ancient complex of mines, and the party, the Fellowship, really have to stretch out their provisions in order to not die. They eventually make it to Dwelloder, and they discover Balin's tomb and the fate of the colony. They're able to learn the history that no one else has, which is great, but also really sad. Gimli keeps the book that has preserved the colony's history, but ultimately they're now in a position where they are themselves surrounded again by the orcs and goblins and have to desperately fight to make their way on out. Durin's Bane is awakened, the Balrog chases after them, Gandalf stands firm at the bridge of Khazad-dûm and falls with the Balrog into the depths of the earth. This is a crazy climactic moment, and we have all the great stuff right here. We have the party coming into this ancient kingdom, these ancient mines, having to use all of their resources and wits to stay alive, having to fight a desperate battle, solving riddles of the past and of what they should do. This is the OG dungeon crawl. But not only is it the OG dungeon crawl, this is a very important moment in the entire story. The ring is able to make it past Saruman's trap and to Lothlorien, but at a great cost. Gandalf is killed. He will later on be brought back as Gandalf the White, which is very important to the rest of the story, but this now allows for doubt and fear to creep into the Fellowship, poisoning the company and eventually leading Boromir to betray Frodo and try to take the ring, which leads to the breaking of the Fellowship. But also, by the Fellowship coming in through the gate that they did, they inadvertently rescued Gollum. And this means that Gollum stays alive, and Gollum is absolutely essential to the successful conclusion of the quest to destroy the One Ring. So not only is the Adventures Through the Mines of Moria a really cool dungeon crawl within the story, but it is essential to character arcs and to important moments later on in the story that would not have happened if the characters hadn't gone through the mines. This is where dungeon crawling can be very important to the overall plot, and where it honestly works best for a story. Again, there's so many isekai anime out there where the character just goes into a dungeon, grinds, comes out super OP, and then boom, it's done. Huzzah! It's like, why did this dungeon exist? It just existed to make the character OP. That is uninteresting. It's a cheap way to make a character overpowered, and it actually robs the overpowered individual of having the depth of a good OP character. So then let's look at an anime that actually does dungeon crawling right. Goblin Slayer, and specifically looking at the goblin invasion of Watertown. Now, I will say this. I did struggle at first to include Made in Abyss on this list because it has all the hallmarks of dungeon crawling, but it is more of a crazy adventure where a lot of the things that you would actually expect to have in a dungeon crawl aren't necessarily there. Now, an argument can be made for Made in Abyss being a dungeon crawl, but in the end I decided to go with the very obvious dungeon crawl of the Watertown invasion. So, this story right here is a pretty big and important one. Goblins have made it into the city of Watertown and are invading it from the depths. This is a pretty big thing because Sword Maiden, who is the guardian of the entire city, has been preventing all kinds of evil from getting in, and she doesn't know how on earth they've gotten in. But what's more is she's completely debilitated from taking action herself for two reasons. One is that no one takes goblins seriously, and number two, she was raped by goblins. As a result of this, Sword Maiden feels incapable of taking the necessary action to save her town, so she reaches out to Goblin Slayer. Goblin Slayer comes with his friends, and they proceed to go through the sewers of Watertown to hunt down the goblins. What they discover is that Watertown is actually built on the remains of ancient dwarven buildings, as well as other buildings depicting a time long past. There's an ancient history that has been lost, and the dwarf shaman definitely finds it interesting, but Goblin Slayer is persistent about we have to defeat the goblins, we get a true dungeon crawl with all kinds of traps being laid by the goblins. There are some real sloggy fights. that lead to nearly the entire party being wiped out. We almost get a TPK. Goblin Slayer just barely survives and manages to rally everyone. So they then have to leave the dungeon, re-equip, and come back on in. And Goblin Slayer then has to use his knowledge from cave dives as well as from bakers of how to defeat the goblins. He's basically like, you know what? The way that we're going to defeat these goblins inside a cave is we're going to cause cave fires. How are we going to do that? We're going to cause a flower fire. We're going to cause a spontaneous combustion with flour, which becomes very important later on because they meet a beholder in the caves. There's a whole lot of great stuff in this particular arc, and it leads to a discovery of other ancient information as well. Ancient secrets such as a mirror that allows for instantaneous travel. This mirror of instantaneous travel has then allowed for legions of goblins to come in from other places to invade Watertown. And what's great here in this particular arc is that Goblin Slayer doesn't do what typical D&D players would do, which is like, sweet, we have this magic mirror. We're either going to sell this for buco bucks or imagine what we could use it on. Ha ha ha! Oh boy, give D&D players a really powerful item and just expect your campaign to be broken by that one item. But what does Goblin Slayer do? He takes it and he seals it in cement. I love it. So basically, any goblin who tries to use it from that point on is just going to smash into a wall of cement and never get through. So it's really neat what Goblin Slayer does right there. And it is, again, a good anime example of doing a dungeon crawl right. Not only does it have all the hallmarks of a good dungeon crawl, but it does progress a very important part of the story, which is the relationship between Goblin Slayer and Sword Maiden. Sword Maiden is going to be someone who not only falls in love with Goblin Slayer, but is going to give Goblin Slayer a variety of tasks which will bring him closer in his quest for destroying the world's population of goblins. Finally, when it comes to stories, oh boy, I can't believe I'm adding this one, but I kind of have to add this one because it is one of the best dungeon crawling stories out there, is the manga Don't Milk Me Merchant-chan. Man, that sends some tingles up my spine, and maybe not in the most pleasant of ways. This manga is absolutely ridiculous. This is a not safe for work story, definitely not meant for little kids. Goblin Slayer isn't meant for little kids, and this one isn't either. This one is definitely the mangaka exploring all the different kinds of fetishes that he has, but weirdly enough, it is an excellent example of dungeon crawling. The reason for that is because, again, it follows all the correct hallmarks and even has a really interesting story. You have dungeons around the world that no one truly understands why they exist, other than they might be reliquaries or like very dangerous oysters to ancient items that have long since been lost to history. Why they've been buried, no one really knows, but an entire ecosystem has been magically preserved within various dungeons to protect these ancient items. So when you descend into a dungeon, you descend into a kingdom hell-bent on killing anyone who comes on into it. Now, the main character, he is on his own personal quest to enter this dungeon, not because he wishes to find this ancient lost to history item, but because he is looking for someone who was lost in the dungeon. But he's not a very powerful individual, his level isn't very high, and so he has to rely on special grade items that are made from what is taken out of the dungeon. And this is where his companion comes in, the merchant, the busty merchant, who uses all of the things that they harvest from the dungeon in order to create powerful items that allow them to delve even deeper. And this is neat right here because the character, as far as the manga has proceeded, never becomes OP. He has to always rely on grinding real hard to get whatever level he can, as well as getting the items and the materials necessary to create even more powerful items, so that way he can go in deeper. And at a certain point, the dungeon just becomes so difficult in terms of puzzles or monsters that he has to rely on even larger parties and more party members in order to go deeper, and so they have to rely on communication, using all of their skills, using all of their items, and there are fights that bleed them dry. There are a couple where they literally have to use everything in order to stay alive, and that just allows them to clear one room or one level of this dungeon, and there's yet more to go. And again, even though they do that, it doesn't lead to them suddenly getting a massive boost in levels. No, they get some experience, they go up a level, they get some items, they get some materials, they then have to regroup and come back and hit the dungeon again. It's a really good, engaging story. Even if you have to put up with everything else that's in it, it's actually really, really good. And that's the kind of thing that you would want to see in a story where, rather than using a dungeon crawl as an element within the story to help progress the overall plot or a certain character arc, instead the dungeon itself is the plot, because someone got lost in the dungeon and the heroes have to find that person who was lost. And boom, you have your investigations, you have your puzzles, you have your quest, you have your monsters, you have your items, you have the grind, and it works really, really well. So those are some examples of good dungeon crawling stories. I highly recommend that you check them out. Even Don't Milk Me Merchant Chan. Oh boy, what a ridiculous story. But if you're looking for a good dungeon crawling idea, or to see how someone did dungeon crawling really, really well, it is a good story. Of course, The Lord of the Rings with the Mines of Moria, Goblin Slayer with Watertown, and also go check out Critical Role in the Folding Halls of Halas. Please check out my mini-series of the Gangs of Errol Lyle. All of those can help you get some ideas of what you can do to make an excellent dungeon crawl for your players. And whether you are doing this for a game of D&D or for a story, remember this: dungeons are meant to only provide a broken glimpse into a long lost past. They're not meant to give all of the answers. Instead, it gives a tantalizing view of what the past might have been like, and it gives you some rewards, some answers, some mysteries, and a whole lot of pain, which you hope then brings the characters together in meaningful ways, so that way their fellowship is made stronger by what they go through. And that is the true reward of doing a dungeon crawl. So if you're looking for any more writing advice, please feel free to check out our other videos here on YouTube. You can also head on over to our podcast, Camille's Harem, found on Podbean, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, the works. We have writing exercises for you to check out over our Pinterest page. And of course, we would love to have conversations with you about your own D&D games and any other things having to do with writing. So please join our ever-growing community of novice authors and leave a comment down below about some of your favorite dungeon crawls or your least favorite dungeon crawls. We'd love to read them. And until the next video, y'all, be wary of wandering in the dungeon alone. Bring a partner. It's more fun. And choose.